Hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Or if it's your first time visiting, you're also welcome. Today I wanted to do a brief introduction into the MBTI personality theory. So perhaps some of you have already heard about this theory, maybe at school, maybe at work, and you're wondering what it means, or maybe you've just been curious about yourself, like you're curious about your personality and you'd like to learn more. So currently there are three major personality theories out there. There's the Enneagram, there's MBTI, and there's the Big Five personality test. And out of all of them, I highly recommend the MBTI test the most, because to me, I find it the most accurate and it has the most depth to it. So what does MBTI stand for? MBTI stands for the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It was made by these two women, Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabella Briggs Meyer. So Catherine was the mother and her daughter was Isabella Myers. And it was made back in the 50s. So these people weren't really scientists, but they still came up with theories based on Carl Jung. So Carl Jung came up with the functions of the MBTI, which we're going to go into. But organizing those functions into a proper system, that was the two women who did that, and I'm glad for it. So basically, when MBTI looks at a person, it looks at four dichotomies, which leads to four letters, which gives you 16 personality types, right? So, for example, you could be an INTP or an ESFJ, and that sounds like gibberish at the moment. What's an INTP? What's an ESFJ? Well, let me basically break down the four dichotomies. So basically, they realize that, people are different, right? So they ask themselves, what are four key ways which we can distinguish people, like four key traits? And then how can we bundle and pack and put these four traits into one package to give a full description of someone's personality, right? So the first dichotomy, which all of you are familiar with, is introverts versus extroverts. Like anyone who knows how to speak English or any language, they know the word introvert and extrovert. That's kind of the basic dichotomy, right? And so you see, most of the world is led to believe that really the only difference between two people is whether someone is an introvert or an extrovert. However, Myers-Briggs says that no, that's wrong, because you actually have 8 types of introverts and 8 types of extroverts, right? So just to give a brief overview, introverts tend to be a bit more quiet, more reflective, and don't necessarily like to socialize as much. However, the other benefits of introversion is they tend to be more independent, less reliant on society, and in some cases, they can be better at long-term thinking, right? Extroverts, on the other hand, we're all familiar with them. They enjoy talking a bit more. They can be more animated, for example, in terms of their body language. So more talkative, more energetic. They like to experience life a bit more, experience things like different experiences, like, hey, let's go to France, let's go cycling, let's go to the gym, let's go to the moon, let's go skydiving. So they tend to enjoy experiencing life a bit more, right? I don't think I really need to break down introversion versus extroversion too much. The only one thing I would say is that extroversion can manifest in different forms. So, for example, someone can be more extroverted when it comes to ideas, in the sense that they like a broad range of ideas as opposed to a narrow range, right? So, now moving on to the next dichotomy, which is asking, how do people process information, right? How do people process information? And the two main ways is sensing versus intuition. And this is in terms of how we take in information. So sensors like to perceive things via the five senses. So sight, smell, touch, hearing, and the other one. So these are very concrete people. They like facts and figures, right? Concrete information. Intuitive people, on the other hand, like to process things through their sixth sense, right? So more of ideas, right? Ideas and abstract concepts apply more to intuitive people. So sensors, if you want to convince a sensor to buy something, you have to be very factual, very grounded in reality, right? You need to give concrete reasons why someone should buy something. But to convince an intuitive person, you need to be focused more on ideas, right? Ideas, concepts, and theories. That's what really appeals to intuitive people. So normally sensors, for example, like an ESTJ, we'll get into that a bit later, but an ESTJ might want concrete data on why they should invest into a company. They might want to see a track record, right? Whereas an intuitive, you just need to sell them on the concept, like how will this product work and how is it going to make a difference, right? So sensors, very detail-oriented people, very good with numbers, very good with, tiny, small details. But unfortunately, compared to intuitives, they might not always see the big picture. So if you're more of a big picture thinker, a big picture intuitive thinker, then it means you have a preference for intuition. If you prefer to work more on the details, it means you're a sensor. And next is, how do we decide on that information, right? So here we have thinkers versus feelers. So I think the problem with marketing and the problem with some of the books written on persuasion is that under the notion that everyone is emotional, that, oh, everyone, just focus on feelings, right? And, advertising companies are like, yeah, just let's just do something that invokes special feelings. And while that might be true, I think it only appeals to half the population because the other half are actually thinkers. So feelers, again, they do like people. Um, they do think about emotions a lot and they make a lot of value judgments, right? So when dealing with someone, they think more about, is this right or wrong from a moral perspective, not necessarily from a logical perspective. So in general, feelers tend to have better relationships, right? So just giving an idea of what we have so far, uh, both of you have two people, both of you might be introverts, right? And both of you might prefer intuition. For example, you're both big picture thinkers, but when it comes to thinking and feeling, you both make judgments differently. So what this means is that A thinker tends to be more logical, again, and still more factually oriented, more scientific. It doesn't mean feelers can't be in the sciences, they can. It's more of judgments we make in our personal lives, like our personal outlook on life. That's really what this dichotomy is about. So, uh, thinkers and feelers have different stereotypes. Feelers are, they're accused of being irrational, which isn't always the case. And thinkers are accused of being a bit too cold, right? Thinkers in general can be a bit too cold, a bit too blunt, a bit too unfeeling, right? And essentially, a good example is like, let's say your kid is riding on a bike and then the kid falls on the bike. So let's say a dad runs up to the scene of the accident. So if the dad was a thinker, they might, look at the kid and let's say from their assessment, the kid looks fine, but they're not sure about the bike. So they might ask, the first thing out of their mouth would be, is the bike okay? So you see, like, that's how they can be seen as a bit crude or unfeeling, right? Because they're just trying to think logically. I mean, that's an extreme example because, a lot of thinkers would ask first if the kid is okay, right? But that just highlights the difference in judgments, you know? Another example could be making a decision of how to go to a university, like which university to go to. I think I would just be like, oh, which is the best university, has my course, all of that factual stuff. But the feeler might be like, oh, which university uh, are all my friends going to? Which university do my parents want me to go to? Right? Do I like the teacher, in terms of the personality? Does the school have a lot of extracurricular activities, right? So they're focusing on things more from a relational perspective, like in terms of relationships and feelings and emotions, whereas thinkers are a bit more logical, right? Or rather concerned with just the hard facts in a way. I'll get more on that later. And then you have judging versus perceiving, and this is about how we orientate ourselves to or orient ourselves to the outside world. So I think basically a judger is kind of like maybe Minecraft, if you know how Minecraft is, like the video game. Basically, a game where you build stuff around yourself, right? And a perceiver is kind of like Super Mario. And what this means is that for judges, they tend to want to control the outside world, right? They prefer if the outside world is heavily controlled and heavily monitored. So judges can be very authoritarian people, very strict people, but also very organized people. Strict, organized, rules, laws. That's what judges thrive on. Perceivers, instead of controlling the environment, they focus on controlling themselves, right? Because in Minecraft, like you create the bricks, or just think of a game where you can manipulate the environment. But in Super Mario, you jump over the bricks, you jump over the turtles. So you don't really disturb the environment. It's more of you react to the environment. You change yourself according to the environment that you're in, right? Judges also tend to be more long-term thinkers. They're a bit more concrete, right? So they want more long-term planning and things to be fixed. Uh, perceivers perceivers tend to be more open and flexible, right? So it's kind of like saying judges like to judge the environment, but perceivers prefer to perceive it, right? So perceivers more flexible, more open-minded, a lot more open-minded, I might add, more open-minded, and just generally tend to go with the flow and much better at improvising. So they're not as organized, but they're better at improvising. So let's say you have a judger and a perceiver in the same room, right? Or in the same town, in the same city. The judger might have a very organized schedule, right? Let's say that city is Nairobi, for example. Both of them might have a very organized, no, not both. One of them, the judger, is going to have a very organized schedule, and maybe the perceiver is going to be a bit messy. And let's say these are teenagers, so they're like 14 to 16 years old. But suddenly both of their parents are like, guess what? We're moving to Greece or we're moving to Italy. So for the judger, it's going to be a harder adjustment for them because they're like, wait, no, don't take me there. I'm used to everything. I'm used to the shop that I go to, the gym that I go to, the friends that I have. The perceiver is more like, yeah, sure, why not? It's a new opportunity and a new place. So in general, judges and perceivers are just oriented very differently to the outside world, right? Another thing is that uh, when judges speak, they kind of speak with an authoritative tone as opposed to perceivers. So they make judgment-based calls. I'll give you an example. Whereas perceivers more of volunteer information, right? So they volunteer information and it's up to you to do whatever you want with the information. So if, let's say, you're standing outside and there's a tree branch about to fall on you, like not immediately, but it looks like it's going to break. So it's gonna fall on to you like maybe in 2 minutes, right? So still a bit of time. A judge will just say, move out of the way, right? They won't tell you why, they'll just issue an order because they perceive things internally. We'll get to that in a moment. They perceive things internally, but they speak their judgments externally, right? So they'll just say move, right? But a perceiver, on the other hand, will say, they'll say exactly that. They'll be like, oh, there's a tree branch that's loose and it looks like it will fall on you. So they volunteer information. They're like, okay, there's a branch about to fall on you. It's up to you. You can move out of the way, you can duck, you can do a roll, you can catch the branch if you want, right? So that's the thing. They're not forcing you into a box. They just give you the information and they're like, you do with that information what you want. But judges being more authoritative and authoritarian, they're more like they'll make the decision for you. They're like, okay, I think the best thing to do would be to move. So rather than waste time, I'll just tell him to move, right? Judges are the type of people who, when a menu comes, they're likely to just either pick the first thing or not spend too much time looking at the menu. Perceivers will not only look at the menu, but they'll also ask questions. They'll ask like the waiter or waitress, you're like, oh, what does this come with? How is it cooked? What does it taste like? What wine does it go with? Right? All these sort of questions, right? So I would say there's actually a bit of tension between judges and perceivers. There can be a bit of tension because they tend to live quite different lives. Most of their attention is focused on how introverts and extroverts live different lives. But I think there's pretty much a lot of tension between judges and perceivers in terms of, forcing things to be closed versus them being open. Even when it comes to countries like China, has that judging mindset of, control, long-term thinking, order. America more has that perceiving concept of, just freedom, just do whatever you want, right? That's a pretty good way of understanding judging versus perceiving. So now we can go back to these letters here, and this is basically the end of part one. So if you understand everything I've said so far, then it's pretty good. It means you have a basic understanding of MBTI, right? So let's look at the types. You have an INTP, for example, right here, right? Well, that's the Esfj. So what does an INTP mean? So he's an introvert, right? Means he's not as talkative. He doesn't enjoy parties as much. He probably enjoys reading a bit more. And he's intuitive, meaning he does like ideas, he does like theories, he does like concepts. He's a thinker, right? So again, he makes logical decisions and doesn't necessarily factor in feelings too much, right? Can be a bit politically incorrect, right? And he's a perceiver, so he likes to wing it. He's very, free flowing and probably more messy than the judger, though he can learn to not be messy. That's an INTP. So, who are some famous INTPs? You have Albert Einstein, Abraham Lincoln, Rene Descartes. A lot of the scientists and philosophers would be INTPs, some INTJs, but a lot of them INTPs. And then you have the ESFJ, which is the exact opposite type, right? The opposite letters. So now an extrovert, someone who's more people focused, people oriented, enjoys going out, going to concerts, going for parties. And then you have sensor. He or she's a sensor. So they prefer concrete things, these people kind of prefer, like, gossiping about celebrities and stuff. They don't really uh, like theories or abstract ideas, and they're feelers, so they focus more on relationships, right? Relationships and, yeah, emotions and caring for people, right? And Jaja, so they're a bit more uh like they like to control the environment a bit more. So if you were friends with these two people, right, you'd probably feel like the ESFJ is friendlier towards you, but you'd get that vibe that, okay, they're kind of a bit controlling. Like when it comes to deciding where to eat, they always want to eat at this place. They always make these fussy schedules that, oh, we have to be there by this time, be home by this time. They might have some weird rules like, yeah, don't eat in my room or anything like that. And, very a bit more controlling. The INTP might not be as friendly. They might be aloof. It doesn't mean that they dislike people per se. It's just more like they might not put any effort towards getting to know you. So, for example, it might be you that needs to approach the INTP, you that needs to make the first move, you that needs to. It's a stereotypical introvert. The extrovert comes, says hi, makes the first move, and then the introvert goes along with it, right? So that's just a difference. And the thing is, they might not be as friendly at first, but the longer you talk to them, the deeper the friendship gets. Because again, introverts have fewer friends, but the relationship is much deeper, right? And the ESFJ, they will be your friend faster, but they will be more controlling. So the main benefit of being friends with an INTP You ask them, where do you want to eat? They're like, I don't know. Where do you want to eat? Or they'll say, yeah, I want to eat here, but if you want to go here instead, that's cool. If you want to hit up your INTP friend for a last minute activity, you're like, hey, let's go hiking this Saturday and it's Friday. They'll be like, okay, I don't have anything to do. Sure, why don't we go? Right? Showing up at your INTP friend's place, you're like, hey, is it okay if I crash here for the night? They'll be like, yeah, sure, why not? Go for it. The ESFJ would be like, oh, you should have told me in advance. Like, maybe due to their feelings, like, yes, they do prioritize relationships, but the judging part of them would be like, why didn't you tell me in advance? Unless it's like a serious emergency. So I think I'll just break this video into two, since we'll cover the functions later. And I just wanted to show you a good website, which is called no, not this one. Mm, Personality page, right? It's called Personality page, where you can read about the 16 types. Let me just go over the 16 types very quickly and just give my opinions on those 16 types, and then later we'll go over the functions. So the first type is an ISTJ. So these people tend to be soldiers, right? Loyal, duty fulfillers. Think about either a soldier or like a boring accountant, those type of people. So introverted, focused on concrete information, the thinking side as well. And, they don't like change. They prefer order, they don't like new things, so they're a bit boring. You can read the full description, right? You can read all of this. I am just giving you the brief description to make it as short as possible, despite this video being long. So very boring people, but in general, very reliable, very, sort of mild-mannered and loyal people. So as I said, best job for them is probably like an accountant or joining the army, because sensors, they can be quite physical as well. Then you have ESTJ the Guardian, so like an extroverted ESTJ, ISTJ, right? So these guys are kind of like the boss, right? It says the Guardian, but I call them the boss. uh, Pretty much every middle management, so lower management up to middle management, that is an ESTJ. So an example of an ISTJ would be Warren Buffett. You know how he invests in stocks, right? So finance and maths. But you know how he doesn't like new things. Like he doesn't invest in the tech industry. He's like, oh, I don't know what the tech industry will look like. So you see, he's very traditional, right? He's very traditional, stick to what I know, very humble, mild-mannered, not very extravagant. That's a good example of an ISTJ. Warren Buffett. ESTJs, they are bossy, right? They do well in terms of mid management positions, lower to mid management positions, very detail oriented, just very sort of uh, how do I put it? Yeah, just bossy. That's kind of the word that comes to mind when I think of an ESTJ. Just think of like a boss who you don't really like most of the time. That would be an ESTJ. And yeah, you can just read more on the type, but that's how I'd summarize them in case you're wondering. There's a difference. I'll get to the difference when I get to ENTJs, but yeah, ESTJs are also very traditional. They have very traditional goals. All people with SJ in their type are very traditional. That's why all the SJs come first. So very traditional. And ESTJ is like, oh, I wanna find a wife and get married by the time I'm 27, have a house, have some kids, very traditional. Just think of a traditional man. Like I would say an ESTJ is probably the definition of a traditional masculine man that ends up being a manager. And then you have ISFJs, the nurturers. That's a good name for them. Think of Alfred. Okay, a good ESTJ is like Captain America, for example. That's a good ESTJ. There's also Damian Wayne from Batman. I can't think of others, but I'll show you a website where you can find more, and we'll go through them a bit in the next video. Then you have ISFJs, naturals. Think of Alfred from Batman as well. So these are gentle, caring individuals. So similar to the ISTJ, the only difference is they focus on emotions and relationships a bit more. So like a nurse, like if you wanted a nurse, you'd probably want an ISFJ or a private caregiver. Like these are very caring, quiet individuals, but not too technology or theory focused, right? But in terms of caring for people, they're number one. And then ESFJ, the caregivers, arguably probably the most traditional woman you can think of. I don't know, picture a woman from the 1950s. That's them. So everything you think like if this was the 50s, everything you think a woman should be, pretty, talkative, flamboyant, smiling, caring for her husband, very, very traditional women. These are ESFJs. And then ISTP, the mechanic or the badass. So think of people like Wolverine, Rambo, and John McClane. So they're very action-oriented individuals, but specifically with tools. So think of maybe policemen, mechanics, physical labor, electricians. These people like to get their hands dirty, essentially. Yeah, they're very, very action oriented, very, very action focused. Think of kind of the silent bad boy with anger issues who likes to be left alone. Maybe like the Hulk could be thought of as an ISTP, not Bruce Banner, but the Hulk, just wants to be left alone. So they are thinkers, but they like to take things apart with their hands. So anything mechanical, that's really where they shine, and that's really the stereotype. So physical work, things they can touch and feel, that's really what they do. And then you have ESTPs. So think of ESTPs as, oh yeah, Clint Eastwood is also an ISTP. Think of ESTPs as the doers. Think of them as the sleazy salesman, the sleazy, fast talking salesman. So ESTPs love parties, very crazy. The player, the playboy, that's the ESTP. Action oriented. They are more action oriented than ISTPs. The only difference is that ISTPs focus more on tools, but ESTPs don't necessarily focus as much on tools. But ESTPs, they love sports. So like a majority of athletes, people who like doing outdoor jobs, like park rangers, police officers as well, any job that has action, ESTPs will be there. ESTPs are also action heroes as well. So Donald Trump is another ESTP, real estate, sales, quick sales. They can be good at business, but they're not very big picture thinkers. They use more of short-term strategies and tactics, right? So that's kind of the description I would give for ESTPs. They do get a lot of women as well. And if they're women, they do get a lot of men, right? So a pretty interesting type. One of my favorite types. Like if I wasn't an INTP, I would want to be an ESTP as my third type. Then ESFP is the performers. So think of Hollywood, like majority of actors and actresses. So while an ESTP would be more of a sportsman or sportswoman, an ESFP would be more of a performer, the art, the emotion behind it. It's not just action, but emotion, right? So pretty much every actor, majority of actors, actresses, musicians, those would be ESFPs. Again, very lively party animals. So arguably the ESFP would be the most traditional woman of today's world, in the sense that just a chick who loves to party, stereotypes about women. I don't repeat some of the stereotypes, but chick who prefers to party, chicks who are not really nerds, right? Not very bookish, but more of outgoing and stuff like that. That's what ESFPs would be. But really, just think parties, parties, parties. They are the life of the party and they love parties. That's the ESFP. ISFPs are artists. That's pretty straightforward. They're very in touch with nature and create a lot of art. So most people who can draw will either be ISFPs or Enneagram 4s. I'll cover what Enneagram is later. And now we have ENTJs. So ENTJs are now the leader of leaders, the leader of the ESTJs. They are long-term, long-range thinkers, very strategic, very rational people who are good leaders, right? Arguably the best personality type. Very, very interesting people. So if you think about politics and world leaders, you'd think about ENTJs and ENFJs as well. So just all the leaders at the top, majority of CEOs, not really in tech companies, but outside of tech companies, those would be ENTJs, right? So guys who are leaders, like the guy who was the head boy at school, or the guy who was prefect, right? Just leader. When you think about a leader, a good leader, you're probably thinking of an ENTJ. Then you have INTJs, scientists like Newton, very bookish, very nerdy, long-term thinkers, out of touch with their feelings. INTJs are the most long-term thinkers, basically, right? So nerdy, bookish, long-term thinkers, stereotyped as being the evil guy in media, this evil guy with henchmen who has a long-term plan. Haha, you've fallen into my trap and stuff. Like, that's the INTJ. ENTP visionaries, the very, very creative inventors like Tony Stark or Phineas from Phineas and Ferb. Those are very good ENTPs. So kind of goofy, but intellectual, and a bit of people skills, but they're not that good with people, right? So, yeah, those are the ENTPs. Da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, those were ENTPs. So very broad interests. They have the most interests out of all types. Jack of all trades, master of none, right? That's an ENTP for you. Yeah. Like I was gonna say Mr. Robot, right? Mr. Robot from Mr. Robot, ENTP. INTPs like Einstein and majority of the people, they're thinkers. They're like INTJs but messy. But they like research and they like science, and they're nerdy, bookish, like Peter Parker. Not Tom Holland's Peter Parker, all the other Peter Parkers. So nerdish, bookish, Peter Parker, Reed Richards, Dr. Octavius, Beast from X-Men, those would be L from Death Note. Those would be the INTPs. ENFJs are also leaders, right? The leaders and businessmen, they love people. They love people the most, and I would say most businesses are started by ENFJs. Business oriented, love to hustle, love money, and uh, a lot of politicians would be either, as I said, ENTJ or ENFJs, skilled at manipulating and controlling people, claim to be nice, but it's all a ruse just to gain control and popularity. Those would be the ENFJs, very popular in high school, right? INFJs, I would more of call this type the mystic. A lot of religious leaders, a lot of religious people would be INFJs, even a few ENFJs, but very spiritual. Like they have intuition, but they believe in the intuition too much to the point where sometimes they think they're psychic. But arguably the most well balanced introvert, because they have the right balance of like thinking and intuition as well as feeling, in such a sense that they're able to be rational while at the same time have a lot of people skills. So some of the philosophers, like people say Plato was an INFJ, Spinoza was an INFJ. So very, very interesting type. Arguably the best introvert. ENFPs are, how would I describe them? They're sort of like ENTPs, but they're more like people who end up as news presenters and sort of the adventurers and stuff, like Trevor Noah, Ellen DeGeneres, right? Those type of people. They're very